So I taught a class just today, a two day class. It was 7 hours. We broke over 2 days, 3.5 hour one day, 3.5 hour the next day. And the name of that class is Diversifying Your Practice. And you'll notice I did not say diversifying your appraisal practice. I did that on purpose. I simply call that course Diversifying Your Practice, and then I guess the subtitle you'd call it Inside and Out. Diversify your practice inside and out. And what I mean by that is diversifying your practice inside your appraisal practice with your appraiser hat on, and leaving some room to diversify your practice outside of appraisal practice, right? So your skill set, your knowledge as a practicing appraiser is extremely valuable. The skill set you have as an appraiser is extremely valuable. And we kind of explore opportunities that you as the working appraiser might have. Now, there's all types of appraisal services. There's consulting services. There's a whole host of things that you're able to do. And maybe there's some things you're not able to do right now, but you might be interested in expanding your knowledge base to take on some assignments that maybe as of this broadcast, you're not competent to do. You know, USPAP allows the flexibility for you to take assignments you're not competent to do. You merely have to disclose your lack of competency, take all steps necessary to get competent, and then describe that in the report, right? So there's a lot of flexibility there. And with the interest rates going up, God, they're double what they were a year ago this time, right? You know, it's funny in that class, I say when and if the rates go up. And that class, I wrote that well over a year and a half ago. So I didn't know we'd be in this situation right now that we're in today. But one thing that's interest rate safe for a few things is divorce. People are going to get divorced regardless of the interest rate. One thing is death. People are going to die regardless of the interest rates. And guess what? They're going to build and widen roads regardless of the interest rates. They're going to need pipelines and easements across property regardless of the interest rates. Properties are going to be stigmatized or contaminated, construction defects, regardless of what the interest rates are. So I have a special guest with me today. Come on back and join the conversation. Hi, this is Bryan Reynolds. You're listening to the Appraisal Update Podcast, brought to you as always by the very fine folks of Appraiser eLearning. We're glad you're here. We hope that you're doing well. And I'm really excited to have a guest on the program that does a little different stuff, and we're going to talk about it. So everyone, please welcome Mr. Rudy Robinson. He's an MAI out of Austin, Texas, or Georgetown area. I was just in Georgetown a few months ago, a great part of the country. He's a certified general appraiser, and he does things, a little different than just the typical appraiser. So, Rudy, welcome to the program. Tell my listeners what it is you do exactly.
Well, when people ask me what I do, I said, I'm an environmental appraiser. And they said, what is an environmental appraiser? I said, someone who values environmental impairment in properties, particularly, whether that be to flood, fire, hurricane, contamination, construction defects, diminution in title, all the things that can make a property defective. And I got into this in the 70s, really late 70s, when I got tired of conventional appraising. I've been doing this for about 50 years. And I needed something to stimulate my interest. You know, when I appraise a office building or shopping center or apartment complex, I kind of know what cap rates are. I kind of know what rents are. I can kind of project an NOI. I can kind of get close on what my value is, what range of value I'm going to be. When I appraise a defective property, I have no clue before I start what I'm going to end up with. And I like the abstract problem solving feature of that.
Yeah,
And
you
that's
gotta
what I got into it.
you gotta employ a lot of critical thinking here, right? Because none of these are going to be the same. So I want to just jump on one right off the bat. And Rudy and we barely talked before I hit the record button. That's a fair statement, I think, right, Rudy? I mean, we chatted for
Yes.
5 minutes tops, and I got just a couple little notes, but for my listeners and certainly anyone that's ever been on a podcast or webinar of mine, we don't rehearse this. It's not scripted. Rudy has no idea what I'm about to ask him, and that being said, I don't try to undermine my guest or catch them or anything like that. But I always say hard questions are allowed. But I did take a couple notes before we started, and one that jumped right out at me was, you said that you worked on the United States border fence, or, some people call it the wall, right? The southern border, the wall, the United States border, the fence, whatever you want to call it. So when you say you worked on that, just kind of walk my listeners through. I mean, you weren't up putting the wall together. We know that. But what does it mean when you say you worked on that project?
Well, we represented several property owners. When I say represented, we were appraising properties for property owners in condemnation, both direct condemnation and inverse condemnation cases, whereby the border wall was encroaching upon their property and leaving them undesirable remainders, specifically because of facts related to where the fence could be located. Some of my clients who were irrigation farmers who had businesses, their clients were Monsanto. These were not mom and pop. These were commercial seed farmers that had tens of millions of dollars per year business impacted by this border fence. They were putting the border fence inland on their property because of a treaty that was signed by Jimmy Carter when he was president of the United States. That's how far back it was, that established where structures inside the levee could go to the Rio Grande. So they had these levees and they could only put them outside the levee at that point, and that dictated where the fence could go. So they were cutting off 90% of the productive farmland that my clients had, and the government wouldn't tell the property owner how they accessed the remainder property. So we couldn't finish our appraisal until we found out if we were going to get a fence or not, a gate or not. And they said, well, we can't tell you that yet because it national security. And so we said, Your Honor, we can't effectively appraise the property till we know what the access rights are. So they said, okay, we're going to give you a gate. I said, how wide is the gate going to be? And they said, we can't tell you that. And I said, I finally go back to the court and says, all right, we got to know how we get in and out of our property. And they said, well, we'll give you a gate. It's going to be 30 foot wide. And I said, that won't work because our irrigation equipment is 50 foot wide. How am I going to get a 50-foot piece of equipment through a 30-foot gate? And they said, all right, we'll give you a 50-foot gate. And then they said, how do we get in and out of the gate? And they said, well, we'll give the owners the code to get in and out of the gate. And I said, well, can they give it to the workers? No, they can't give it to the workers. And they said, well, our workers go in and out of the gate 60 times a day.
Wow.
What happens if we give our code away? And they said, we'll prosecute you for treason. And we had all this going on back and forth. And we finally established what the rules of engagement were going to be, and we could finish our appraisal.
Right.
Well,
right.
Some of the poor farmers, they accepted early settlements for nominal dollars without knowing what their access rights were going to be to the remainder. We had a cousin to one of my clients who accepted $17,000 compensation for the fence on his property, and we got his neighbor $2.5 million for the same right of way.
Wow.
Because we asked enough questions, and we forced the government to give us a practical use to the remainder property. Needless to say, that cousin was very upset that he got hoodwinked by the government, but
Yeah.
that just shows how
I'm just
useful that the appraisal process can be.
Oh, 100%, 100%.
Educate the property owner's property rights.
I'm just curious. And I'm not an attorney. I don't think you are either, but this is more probably a legal question. But would that cousin have, is there any recourse of, because I think in the condemnation, in most instances, they're supposed to give just compensation, right? When you have a taking, you're supposed to get just compensation. Now that's the question. What's just compensation?
The problem with that cousin is he didn't force condemnation. He signed over his rights on a fair sale, negotiated fair sale.
Oh no.
So he is actually having to use his cousin's property to get access to his remainder as we speak.
Oh, how depressing! Oh my goodness.
Now, he's lucky. He's lucky he's related to my client.
Yeah. So for everyone listening, that story right there would be a good example, right, of why a property owner should not negotiate that. They should hire a value. Maybe you're being offered a reasonable amount, but without getting an appraisal, you don't know if you are or not. So that's a great testimonial as to why a property owner ought to get an independent appraisal before they just take the offer, right? I mean, you might get $17,000 when you could have got $2.5 million. It's crazy. And so just so the listeners understand what we're talking about, when we use the terms condemnation, right? That's the actual act or the act of the taking, right? This is through the governmental powers of eminent domain, and that's granted via the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution. So the condemnation is actually the act, right? And nothing would prevent even a residential appraiser to look at the road plan. Let's look at the 10-year comprehensive plan. And okay, they're going to build a road down this way, and I could start going and soliciting all the property owners down that new road corridor and say, look, it's on the books. They're going to widen this road, and they're probably going to be knocking on your door offering you some money for a taking or a partial taking. And guess what? You don't have to accept what they offer. You can get an appraisal and make sure you're happy with what you're getting. I don't know. That could be an opportunity to solicit some business there. But that's an interesting, that's actually an unbelievable case there. That's Rudy. Before we get off the condemnation aspect, I want to, anytime I'm on this topic, I like bringing up the Kelo case, right? And I don't know if you're familiar with that or not, but it's a case where ultimately the Supreme Court of the United States of America ruled, yeah, they could do it. And it hurts me when I talk about that. Because my understanding, it was a lot of property owners, and some had been in their family for years and years and years. And the government basically said it was okay to take the land to build, was it a casino or a hotel or something like that they were going to do?
Something of that nature.
Yeah, it wasn't a school. It wasn't to put roads in, which when we think about the governmental right to take your private property for the benefit of the good, right? That's what we normally talk about when we talk about eminent domain. So we're going to take your property and we're going to build a school or, an interstate or something along those lines. That kind of, you could digest that a little bit better. But you're going to take private property and build a casino and a hotel? That just seems wrong. And the argument on the other side was, well, it is going to benefit the public because we will provide jobs, and we will have a tax base, so there'll be tax revenues, and that benefits the public. And unbelievably, the Supreme Court of the United States passed it, and it proceeded. Well, guess what? They took all the people's property, and they never built anything. because of the bad publicity and what they got. So now how horrible is that? But I thought I read not long ago that there were like 40 or 45 states that passed eminent domain reform laws, where there's state legislation that kind of prohibits kilo-like takings. And I don't know, I just find that pretty interesting. Anyway, my listeners can check that out. It was called the Kelo case, Kelo, if you want more information on that. That's just one personally where I think the Supreme Court got that one wrong. But let's move on. You mentioned flood, hurricanes. What's your job function when a hurricane comes through? How are you involved in something like that?
Well, generally, there are allegations of a taking if there's a government involved, a government entity involved, something that the government did or did not do, often called an exaction. And in some cases, the Corps of Engineers is responsible for regulation of floodwaters related to hurricanes. It happened down in Louisiana with Katrina. So one of the examples of consequence of a hurricane, Rita, Katrina, several of the hurricanes that hit New Orleans, it impacted the Dixie Brewery on Tulane Avenue, which I appraised for LSU and the VA because it was a historic landmark. It hadn't operated as a brewery since 1985. And this was in 2010. I come along and they're going to make it part of the medical center complex that they're redoing as part of an economic redevelopment effort to re-stimulate the New Orleans economy. And they couldn't tear down the building. It's a national landmark. But when I got to the property, it had 5 feet of standing water, no roof due to the hurricanes, PCBs, leaking underground storage tanks, lead, and asbestos. So I got a couple local appraisal firms to hire that work for me down there to appraise it unimpaired by any environmental conditions. And their range in value was somewhere between 2.3 and $3 million. Well, the remediation cost of this building was $5 million. The government had never condemned a property and asked the property owner to pay them. So that was the dilemma, and that's why I was brought into the equation. Through brownfield tax credits and other investment tax credits and redevelopment credits, we were able to come up with a positive $400,000 to offer the property owner. Louisiana is a different state than the rest of the union. They have an eminent domain law that allows the property owner to speculate on what the future market value of the property might have been, but for the condemnation, or in Louisiana, they call it expropriation. And the property owner wanted $30 million for the value of this shell building that was contaminated.
Wow.
Hadn't paid his taxes in the last 10 years and owed the city of New Orleans over $3 million. Well, that is an example of the type of appraisal problem that I get myself into periodically because other people know I fool with this kind of stuff. And they ultimately settled with the property owner out of court because we, on cross-examination of their expert, proved that his $30 million appraisal was economically infeasible to build. And then they came off their high horse on their valuation, and we were able to settle it at a reasonable number. Or the government was able to settle it at a reasonable number. In that case, it was a state government. But that's an example of how I could get involved in a hurricane.
How many states have you appraised property in, or consulted on?
17 in the U.S., Canada, UK, Guam, uh, and
Been
Australia.
Australia. How do when you go to Guam or Australia? I mean, how does the valuation process differ from that in the States, or does it?
Well, I wasn't the primary expert in those assignments. I was a consulting, non-testifying expert. I
Gotcha.
was advising local experts on how I do what I do in the United States and how they might anticipate uh, being cross-examined by opposing counsel should their cases go to trial. Um, and there are certain peculiar uh, laws in the Outback that are not applicable here, um, relative to admissibility of market data and evidence. In the area the poor appraiser was working in the Outback, there is no MLS. There were
Mm.
no data sources. There were no public sources you could go to get comparable sales. The way to find comparable sales there was to go knock on a door and ask the buyer what he paid for the property, and you're at the mercy of him telling you good day, mate, and goodbye, or learning. There wasn't even good assessor records so that you could find out what the information sold from the local assessor.
Wow.
Um, so
Wow.
getting data there is extremely challenging, and quantifying diminution value relative to a externality is even more challenging.
Brings a whole new
They
meaning to non-disclosure, doesn't it?
Oh yes.
Non-existent data. It sounds like that's unbelievable. So, Rudy, I could talk to you all day, and we've got some time left, but it's man, the clock is ticking quick. What would you say are some of the most interesting? If you had to pull up maybe the last two cases that you were involved that were extremely interesting that you would love to work on something again like that, what would you say those last two were?
Well, certainly the Exxon Valdez spill was one. The other one they made a movie. Some people may have seen it. It's called Aaron Brockovich. I
Hmm.
worked on the plaintiff side of that case, and uh, that was interesting. In fact, the sequel to that story uh, is still being written. I had a call several years ago prior to the fires in California caused by the down power lines that burn up the wineries and the vineyards in Napa Valley. The primary defendant in the Aaron Brockovich case was um, the power utility company, uh, Pacific Gas and Electric. Well, they were also the responsible party on the fires in the Napa Valley.
Hmm.
The lead plaintiff in that case, in the Aaron Brockovich case, was not a decrepit woman dying of cancer as portrayed in the movie, but rather a 24-year-old horsewoman. And she called me prior to those fires in California and said, Mr. Robinson, I moved my ranch. I got $4 million from my settlement. I moved my ranch 10 miles away from the plume, thinking that I'd moved far enough away. Well, my horses are dropping dead again on the ranch, and they're now offering me $12 million if I won't hire Erin and her attorneys again. And
Wow.
she said, I'm thinking about moving to Montana and leaving the state and taking my money and run. And I said, I would if I were you, because 12 million in the bank's worth about a lot, knowing the uncertainty of the defendant. And lo and behold, a few months later, they caused those fires and filed bankruptcy in California, and they no longer exist. So she was one of the lucky ones that got out before the Pacific Gas and Electric dissolved.
Got her money
Uh,
before. Yeah. Wow.
yeah,
Wow.
but that's one of the more interesting cases that the I also worked on a case in Wabash, Massachusetts that they made a movie out of. was called a civil action. John Travolta was the actor in it, and I started working with EPA after the trial lawyer went bankrupt because he couldn't prove causation. We came in and got $156 million for the cleanup cost of the Superfund site for the people that lived around there. We finally got the environmental condition remediated, but it took $156 million to clean up the mess.
And so a case like that, right? $156 million to clean this mess up is what I'll call it. How long were you involved in working on a case like that?
That one was only 3 years.
3 years. Okay.
The most interesting case I've worked still pending. The lawsuit was filed in 1969. I was hired in 1998. I finished my appraisal in one. We went to mediation and got the largest recorded judgment in the history of the United States, Indian legislation. My client was the Alabama Coshada Indian tribe, and they sued United States of America for 109 trespass of their lands. And my job was appraising the 12 counties of Texas from 1845 to 1957, from the time Texas was a state till the time Congress passed the Aboriginal title, depriving the tribe of its use of oil and gas royalties, timber harvested, and surface rentals. And they still haven't been paid a dime here as of 2022.
Wow.
They went back to DOJ and said, we'll give you our judgment if you'll give us a gaming license on our land in East Texas, because gaming is illegal in Texas, and if they could get a casino on their land, that would be a way to get payback on this.
Wow.
But,
now you broke up.
That has not been.
Hadn't been remedied yet. So you broke up just a little bit. And I want to get those dates again. You said from 1845 to what was it?
1957.
And am I understanding that was like the effective date of the appraisal? Is that what you're telling me? From 1845 to 1957, when they didn't have the full use of what they owned.
12.5 million acres.
Wow.
And through a sovereignty argument, they got the damage claim down to 2.5 million acres because they proved that land didn't originate from the United States. It came from Spain. So they carved out Spindletop, which is one of the world's most prolific oil, and that carved several $1 billion off the table.
John,
that's probably the most interesting.
Rudy, I'm just curious. Have you started writing a book yet? Because it sounds like to me you should author a book. I mean, these are, I could have you on here all day long, and we're out of time. But you should put a book together. Have you ever thought about doing that?
No, some people have suggested such, but I've just been too busy. I've got 20 jury trials in 3 different states right now. I had 32 at the beginning of last year pending, and as soon as those are over, I'm going to unplug and hit the golf course.
Relax a little bit. Well, it sounds like you deserved it. So two final questions for you. One, if we'll do this one now. If someone wanted to reach out to you, somebody's listening, and they say, "Oh man, I just got a notice that they're taking my property. I don't want 17,000. I want 2.5 million. How do I hire Rudy?" If somebody's listening right now and they would like to get in touch with you, what is the best way to reach out to you, Rudy?
Well, if I have a license to practice in their state, and I feel it's economically feasible for me to help them, they can reach me. I have a website, austinval.com. My email address is rrr@austinval.com. But they'd be well advised to find a good attorney to represent them and ask that attorney who they use in that market area that they feel is competent to represent them
Sure.
and their interest in the property. But
Sure.
generally that's the barrier to entry on most cases I do out of court. Incompetent appraiser to help me. I can't go state because it takes me too long to become geographically competent to do the work.
Yeah, I struggle with that term, and that's a whole different conversation. I like to call it due diligence, but you're right. That's a term that we hear a lot, geographic competency. I believe you're either competent or you're not. Now, to your point, I don't know your market, so I can't come down there and even appraise a house and do a good job. But it's not because I don't know how to. It's because I'm not familiar with your area and the nuances. It's totally geographic, but I like calling it due diligence, and I need to have a conversation with the Appraisal Foundation. I'd like that. I'd like to get that. It's a pet peeve of mine, but I do understand your point. You've got to be familiar with your market area in which you're working. So the last question I have for you is this: if I have a listener right now and they're intrigued by what you're saying, and I was just talking in class today, I hit kind of a brick wall there for a while, and that's why I kind of took a couple steps back and took a right and moved in another direction. I juggle about 5 different things, so I love what I do. But I like to learn, I like to expand. So if somebody's listening right now and they're like, Rudy sounds like an interesting guy, and my goodness, listen to what he's worked on. I want to be Rudy when I grow up, right? So what would you tell someone if they're listening right now and they're thinking, I would be interested in maybe learning more about how to get in condemnation work, or learning more about stigmatized properties or construction defects, obviously they need to take some education. But what would your recommendation be to someone like that listening in right now?
Find somebody in your geographic area that practices in those area and take them to lunch and pick their brain, go to their website, review the information on their website, search for white papers that have been published in the subject you're curious about. And if you're interested in contamination, my wife gave me the idea, said, well, if you are going to specialize in this area, you need to go back to school. So in the late 70s, early 80s, I went over to the little college we have east of here called Texas A&M, and they have an environmental extension office. And I took some environmental engineering courses, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, environmental remediation, hazardous treatment, storage, and disposal. Well, at those classes, I met engineers who were doing the same thing. I was the only appraiser there, but that became a source of business for me. My interaction with those engineers, several of which were government employees with the Corps of Engineers, the Department of the Navy, Department of Air Force. I told you that the majority of the environmental problems we have are government-related sites. Well, those engineers were there because they were studying and preparing for a remediation assessment that they were having to do internally.
Wow.
So that's a source of business. I also ran into some environmental lawyers that were taking courses to aid them in the knowledge of the industry. And if you're going to be interested in practicing eminent domain, go to all the eminent domain conferences and courses you can find to educate yourself on that process.
Absolutely. It is a specialized field. There's no question about it. And I think the key to most anything you want to get involved in is be a sponge, soak up as much knowledge and content that you can, get the education you can, and those relationships that you foster along the way can, like you said, end up end up being business connections on down the line. So that's wonderful. Rudy Robinson, thank you so much for being here. It's been a great conversation. I could keep you all day, and we'll have to have you back again sometime soon. Get on the golf course. Enjoy yourself. It sounds like you've been a busy man.
All right. See you, Bryan.
Thanks very much, Rudy. You've been listening to the Appraisal Update Podcast, brought to you as always by the fine folks over at Appraiser eLearning. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're staying safe. Now might be a time for you to get some of that education Rudy was talking about, because you're probably a little slower. So pick out something that you think that you might like to do and gravitate toward. You can always do what you've always done, but man, wouldn't it be nice to add another little tool in your appraisal toolbox? It's something to think about. For Rudy Robinson, MAI out of Georgetown, Texas, I've been there. I'll probably be coming back. I'm your host, Bryan Reynolds. Until next time, happy appraising.
The Appraisal Update Podcast is brought to you by Appraiser eLearning.